Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome back to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chidello.
This week, the clock is ticking on a new trade war, this time with Mexico over border security.
The clock has also been ticking on a real war in Iran. We're going to look at who's pushing America towards conflict.
Their aim is to topple the government there.
The president has made his first state visit to Britain as the world remembers two anniversaries, D-Day.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the arrival of the official party.
And Tiananmen Square.
He didn't think it was time for an emotional response.
And I'll crunch the numbers on the Trump tax cuts. Yay, tax talk! Let's not dilly-dally!
President Trump embarked on his first state visit to Britain and Ireland this week before heading to Europe on a trip timed to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings in World War II. Among the first stops, a state dinner with the Queen at Buckingham Palace.
I'm delighted to welcome you and Mrs. Trump to Buckingham Palace this evening.
I offer a toast to the eternal friendship of our people, the vitality of our nations, and to the long-cherished and truly remarkable reign of Her Majesty, the Queen.
It was also an occasion to farewell the outgoing British Prime Minister Theresa May, who's stepping down after failing to reach an agreement on a deal to exit from the European Union. One of the key sticking points to Brexit, of course, is the status of the border between the Irish Republic, which remains in the Union, and Northern Ireland, which is slated to leave. The President made this rather eyebrow-raising slip to the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar.
And I think that'll all work out. It'll all work out very well. And also for you, with your wall, your border. I mean, we have a border situation in the United States, and you have one over here.
They really want to avoid, of course, is a border or wall between.
No, I think you do. I think you do.
President Trump reportedly wanted that event to be at his Irish golf property rather than the airport. Varadkar had refused, prompting Trump to consider cancelling his entire visit. Meanwhile, thousands gathered at a demonstration in London's Trafalgar Square to protest Mr Trump's visit to the UK. Also in attendance, a large inflatable baby Trump balloon, which was later stabbed by a woman claiming to be a Trump supporter. Labor leader Jeremy Corbyn spoke at that rally condemning racism and misogyny. President Trump said he decided he wouldn't meet with Corbyn.
I think that he is, from where I come from, somewhat of a negative force.
The week began with the president's announcement of new tariffs on all imports from Mexico to take effect next Monday.
On June 10th, the United States will impose a 5% tariff on all goods coming into our country from Mexico until such time as illegal immigrants coming through Mexico into our country stop.
The president said the tariffs would gradually increase until the illegal immigration problem is solved. But with the president overseas, it was left to his staff to try and stare down a rebellion from Senate Republicans who threatened to side with Democrats and overturn the tariffs with a veto-proof two-thirds majority.
I think it's safe to say you've talked to all of our members. We're not fans of tariffs. We're still hoping that this can be avoided.
Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Democrat Chuck Schumer said the president was just bluffing.
Makes these threats and then he backs off when he sees the danger. I have a feeling that this one just popped into his head.
So the president then switched back on his global roaming and sent out this tweet from London.
Can you imagine crying Chuck Schumer saying out loud for all to hear, I am bluffing with respect to putting tariffs on Mexico? What a creep.
I think by talking about bluffing, Schumer might be trying to suck Trump in there, to be honest, because these tariffs are potentially a problem for Trump. They're due to increase from 5% on Monday to 10% in July, 15% in August, all the way up to 25% in October, where Trump says they will remain until the numbers of immigrants come down substantially. Now, that there is a significant tax on American consumers. And if you don't believe me, just look at the price increases over the last few years for imports not affected by tariffs and compare them to the price increases for Chinese imports that are affected by tariffs. It's not a small tax either. Just the 5% tariff rate alone, plus all the other tariffs Trump's got going on right now, add up to an effective $87 billion tax hike per year. And if Trump delivers all the tariffs he's threatened, that makes $303 billion a year, or $2,000 extra per tax return, hitting low-income earners the hardest as well. That would negate all the president's tax cuts plus more. Now, I understand why Trump is frustrated with immigration. The border is genuinely out of control. These are the interceptions on the southern border for the last 5 years, and these are the interceptions from this year. Interceptions have just gone up another third just this month, the highest levels since 2006. But this tariff penalty creates all kinds of issues. 2/3 of trade with Mexico is back and forth within companies. Mexico is an integrated part of the American supply chain, so these tariffs make American exports more expensive. This also undermines the Chinese tariffs because companies would normally punish China by buying products from Mexico instead. Now they can't. But most self-defeating of all, American exports make up 37% of the Mexican economy, which is moving into recession. So these tariffs could hurt the Mexican economy a lot. And you know what happens when the Mexican economy fails? You get a lot more Mexican illegal immigrants. Regardless, Congress is doing everything but set their hair on fire to warn Trump that they're going to block these tariffs with a veto-proof majority, and Mexico are making all the right noises for a dignified back-down. So let's see if Trump takes the hint.
We will find out in the next few days.
Yes. Now to Iran, and only 3 weeks ago we were talking about the drumbeats of war, but that drummer seems to have gone on a smoko. Mike Pompeo has offered to negotiate with Iran with no preconditions, and the president is sounding mighty friendly.
And I know so many people from Iran. These are great people. It has a chance to be a great country with the same leadership. We're not looking for regime change. I just want to make that clear. We're looking for no nuclear weapons.
Yet there's still a split message. National Security Advisor John Bolton warned that Iran could expect a very strong response from America if Iran or its surrogates launched any attacks. And that surrogate bit is important, because just this week, Hamas admitted to receiving military and financial support from Iran, including the rockets that they recently fired at Israel. And one of the reasons people get nervous about John Bolton is because of clips like this.
The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
That was when Bolton got paid $40,000 to speak at the conference for a group of Iranian dissidents called the MEK. They've been trying to lobby America for Iranian regime change for years now, including with their own shady Facebook campaign designed to sway American opinions. Where do these guys fit into the picture, and what does it mean for Iran? We're joined now by foreign policy analyst Danielle Plotkin. Danielle, who are the MEK and what's their story?
Well, that's probably longer than your TV show will allow, but the Mujahideen Khalq is an opposition group in Iran. They have been based in Iraq, they've been based in Paris, they've got lots of affiliates all over the world, and many people believe that they are run like a cult.
And what do they want?
Well, they would like to rule Iran instead of the current people who are ruling Iran. Like many opposition groups, their aim is to topple the government there. The problem is that over the years they have embraced terrorist methods to do that, including in the past against American citizens. That's why in America they were on the US designated list of terrorist organizations for many years.
Every time I see these MEK guys, it seems to be at some massive, expensive conference featuring a lineup of famous speakers that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where do they get their money from?
That is a fantastic question. You know, I worked in the government for 10 years and the MEK at that point was still on the terrorism list. And I asked everybody, the CIA, the FBI, their own people, where they were getting their money. And frankly, it's not entirely clear to me to this day. I cannot believe given how much they spend buying various people, that they are raising it man by man by man in a fundraising operation.
Now, the MEK left Iran, 40 years ago? And as you say, since then they've been dealing with Westerners. They've even played footsies with Saddam Hussein at one point in time. I can't imagine they'd be wildly popular in Iran. Do they retain any support in Iran at all?
I don't believe so. They would argue that certainly there are people who support them. And of course, it is a measure of how unpopular the government there is right now that the MEK has any support. But no, I believe that they're widely unpopular. They sided against Iran with Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. They've murdered any number of Iranian citizens. I don't think that they have any standing inside the country worth speaking of.
As you say, at one point in time, the MEK was a terror organisation. I know they haven't been engaged in terror recently, but isn't there some kind of stigma for American politicians who are associated with ex-terrorists?
I always thought that there should be, and the bottom line is that they very aggressively make the argument that that was the old MEK, that that's not who they are now, that they've shared their Marxist past that was at the root of their attacks on American business people inside Iran in the 1970s. And I guess that that and a little bit of financial persuasion actually does the job for them.
Do you think that there's a conflict of interest for senior administration figures to have very recently taken something like 40 grand to speak at MEK conferences?
Yes. I've always argued that there is a conflict of interest, that American leaders and politicians who have engaged with them in the past should not be in a position of making decisions about them now. But that's not a decision for members of the public in America to make. It's an argument that we can have in public, but at the end of the day, it's a decision for members of Congress and for the executive branch.
All right, let's go a little bit more broadly now. How would you grade the administration's handling of Iran so far?
It's been absolutely remarkable. I had a lot of doubt about their strategy, a lot of doubt about what would happen when President Trump ripped up the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal. And the reality is that they have had a stunningly successful policy, and the real question that confronts us is not why is American policy going astray, it's what does the United States hope to achieve with the success of the new sanctions regime. The Iranians are absolutely being crunched under this new sanctions regime. Our European and Asian allies are cooperating with it. So what does the Trump administration want? What's their end game?
The administration insists that they're not looking for regime change in Iran. They're just trying to reform Iran's behaviour. Others say that the requests they're making of Iran are simply too stringent to expect any regime to agree to. So it's kind of like regime change in disguise. What would you say?
The problem inside the Trump administration is that there is a sort of a diversity of views about what the aims of the current US policy are. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind that President Trump wants to use sanctions and U.S. pressure, the so-called maximum pressure campaign, to get Ayatollah Khamenei or President Rouhani to the table for negotiations, much as he negotiated with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. I'm not entirely sure that the president's national security team shares that ambition.
That's very diplomatic. We have heard that Trump is genuinely concerned about being pushed into a war with Iran. He doesn't want to do it. Do you think that that's true, or do you think that he and John Bolton are just playing good cop, bad cop?
Well, I don't know. I can't pretend that the president or John have been confiding in me, but I have known John for decades. He worked with me at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, and John is not a huge believer in the power of negotiations with rogue states. For good reason. We don't have a stellar track record. But I have no doubt about the president's bona fides on this. He's been very clear and straightforward. He wants to get the Iranians to the table, and he has caused his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Advisor to sing that tune as well.
Danielle Plotkin, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
No Democratic presidential candidate has won the Lone Star State of Texas since Jimmy Carter in 1976. Yet, a new poll this week suggests it is not out of the question in 2020. President Trump won the 38 Electoral College votes in Texas by a margin of 9 points in 2016. But this poll from Quinnipiac has former Vice President Joe Biden beating President Trump in Texas by 4 points. Trump beat Warren by 1, Buttigieg by 2, O'Rourke and Sanders by 3 and Harris by 4. But even worse news for the president, in the state of Michigan, which Donald Trump won by a margin of just 10,000 votes in 2016, all of the top Democrats are beating him. Biden and Sanders lead President Trump by a whopping 12-point margin. Pete Buttigieg leads Trump by 6, Warren by 4 and Harris by 3. And things are looking little better for President Trump in the South. Trump won a crucial victory in North Carolina in 2016, beating Hillary Clinton by 3.5 points to claim the Tar Heel state's 15 Electoral College votes. This week, an Emerson poll had the president 12 points behind Biden, 8 points behind Bernie Sanders, 4 points behind Buttigieg, tied with Elizabeth Warren, leading Kamala Harris by 2. So interesting that he's only beating the one black candidate in the old Confederate South. Make of that what you will. As for the race for the Democratic nomination, 3 weeks before the first two candidate debates, little has changed. Joe Biden has extended his lead over Bernie Sanders by 1 point to 19, that according to the weekly Morning Consult poll. Then comes Warren on 10, up 1. Harris and Buttigieg steady on 7. O'Rourke and Booker, the only other candidates getting more than 1% support. And as far as President Trump is concerned, it's the media's fault.
If the corrupt media was actually fair, I would be up by 25 points. Nevertheless, despite the fake news, we're doing great.
But Joe Biden didn't have it all his own way this week, Chaz, because his record on abortion has come under renewed scrutiny, specifically his long-time support of a ban on federal funding for abortions under the 1970s era Hyde Act. This week, Biden's rivals, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, said they disagree with the former VP on this.
This isn't about the politics, this is about what's right. The Hyde Amendment should not be American law.
As a senator from Delaware, Biden voted against federal abortion funding literally dozens of times, including supporting a ban on allowing Medicaid to be used to pay for abortions in cases of rape or incest. Well, earlier today, facing growing claims that he was out of touch with the modern Democratic Party, Joe Biden announced a major change of heart. Without apologising for his previous opposition, he says, given new restrictions on access to abortions now, he no longer supports the Hyde Act.
If I believe health care is a right, as I do, I can no longer support an amendment that makes that right dependent on someone's zip code.
This issue has been a complete mess for Biden, John. First, he told this lady here he opposed the Hyde Amendment.
Will you commit to abolishing the Hyde Amendment, which hurts poor women and
yes,
women of color?
Yes, and by the way, ACLU member, I got a near perfect voting record my entire career.
I heard you did, but I'm glad you just said you would commit to abolishing the Hyde Amendment.
Right now, it has to be, it can't stay.
Then Biden's campaign said that he supported the Hyde Amendment and that Biden actually thought the questioner there was asking about the Mexico City rule, even though she said the words Hyde Amendment twice, and that sounds nothing like the phrase Mexico City rule. And then he had that weird qualifier John mentioned where he's not in favour of the government subsidising poor people's abortions unless states effectively make abortion illegal. And then he's okay with poor people's illegal abortions being government funded if they were legal? Whatever. And now, because he was basically the only Democratic candidate who opposed taxpayer-funded abortions, he's backflipped on his backflip and adopted a less popular policy. Polling from 2016 suggests only 29% of the public want to get rid of the Hyde Amendment. And by the way, even Democrats were pretty much 50-50 about allowing taxpayer-funded abortions. Even low-income earners disapprove of taxpayer-funded abortions, 55 to 26, and the policy impacts them the most. Joe Biden's campaign is just being Bidened.
Yes, very flexible for a 76-year-old with all those backflips. Joe Biden, meanwhile, did unveil his climate change policy this week. It included this rather dire warning.
Rising sea levels, warming temperatures, shrinking snow cover and ice sheets. It's already happening. And science tells us that how we act or fail to act in the next 12 years will determine the very livability of our planet.
All very Al Gore. Biden wants to rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty, and he says he wants to set a target of achieving zero net emissions by 2050. But the text of the policy contains several paragraphs that had apparently been lifted without attribution from both industry and environmental groups. The suggestion of plagiarism brought back unfortunate memories of Joe Biden's first White House campaign in 1988, which was scuttled by a plagiarism scandal. Then Senator Biden had used a number of lines taken from speeches by British Labor leader Neil Kinnock in a TV debate. And then reporters started digging into his past. They discovered that he'd been failed for plagiarism in an essay he wrote in law school in the 1960s. It was all very unfortunate at the time. President Trump was happy to chip in on that on Twitter as well.
Plagiarism charges against sleepy Joe Biden on his ridiculous climate change plan is a big problem, but the corrupt media will save him.
Well, the corrupt media then spent much of the week entering various policies into anti-plagiarism programs, and they found that Biden is actually far from alone when it comes to lifting language from other sources without citation. But of course, those other policies and other candidates, Chaz, do not have the history of Joe Biden. So this may just gain a bit of resonance.
Yeah, although to be fair to 2019 Joe Biden, the 1988 plagiarism was a lot worse. Biden stole Neil Kinnock's entire biography.
He basically said he was Welsh.
Yeah, he pretended his dad was a coal miner. That was, of course, the first time that Joe Biden's presidential campaign was Bidened.
As well as marking the 75th anniversary of the Allied D-Day landings, this week it was 30 years since the brutal crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Then President George Bush was an old China hand, and his measured response drew criticism that he was more concerned about US-China trade relations than democracy or human rights.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
June the 5th, 1989, George Bush has been president for just 5 months. He's facing the first great international crisis of what would be a presidency dominated by foreign affairs.
During the past few days, elements of the Chinese army have been brutally suppressing popular and peaceful demonstrations in China. There's been widespread and continuing violence, many casualties, and many deaths.
Assessing the scale of the massacre was made more difficult by the sheer brutality. After troops entered the square firing live bullets at 1 a.m, tanks rolled in to pulverise the remains of victims and even wounded survivors.
And we deplore the decision to use force, and I now call on the Chinese leadership publicly, as I have in private channels, to avoid violence and to return to their previous policy of restraint.
But Bush wasn't just urging restraint from the Chinese, he was practicing it himself.
This is not the time for an emotional response, but for a reasoned, careful action that takes into account both our long-term interest and recognition of a complex internal situation in China.
President Bush believed he knew China and its internal complexities well. He'd served as the US envoy to China in the mid-1970s and returned a month after taking office on one of his first overseas trips as president. At the time, the US travelling media had hailed China's progress.
China's bold economic reforms have radically changed people's lives here. But there have also been unpleasant spin-offs, baffling the communist leadership and scaring the people. The biggest one, inflation, officially put at 18% last year. Some say it's more than 50%.
And it was concerns over being unprepared for the new economy as much as free speech and democracy that triggered the first student protests in Tiananmen Square in April. In May, a state visit by reform-minded Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev drew more attention to the demonstrations.
The Chinese campaign for democracy threatened to make the leadership lose face. During the day, student leaders met with the education minister, but still the rally in Tiananmen Square went on.
The official welcome of Gorbachev planned for Tiananmen Square was cancelled, but the students praised the progress Gorbachev had brought.
Reform in Soviet Union is much more well organized than that in China.
We think that in China, we also can borrow something from the Soviet Union.
The Chinese students wanted some of Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, allowing increasingly open discussion of political and social issues. That worried the Chinese leadership. Gorbachev, in turn, wanted to learn from China's economic progress.
Despite extra security, the growing democracy demonstrations forced one meeting to be moved away from Tiananmen Square. It did not, however, prevent Gorbachev from making one of his famous unscheduled motorcade stops to shake hands with people.
Gorbachev refused to meet with the protesters, not that his Chinese hosts would have allowed it, and he warned against hotheads wanting to reform socialism too quickly. Meanwhile, the number of protesters in the square swelled from 500,000 to around 1 million. 2 days after Gorbachev left, the Chinese government imposed martial law, and 2 weeks later came the bloody crackdown. It was a complex equation for President Bush to consider: how to support human rights and democracy without alienating both the Chinese and even the Soviets, how to encourage greater economic reforms and engagement with the United States without driving the newly reconciled communist powers away from reform and into a closer alliance against the West.
It would be a tragedy for all if China were to pull back to its pre-1972 era of isolation and repression.
So, what was he going to do about it?
Suspension of all government-to-government sales and commercial exports of weapons, suspension of visits between U.S. and Chinese military leaders, sympathetic review of requests by Chinese students in the United States to extend their stay.
In effect, President Bush was blaming China's military for the crackdown, not the leadership under the 85-year-old Deng Xiaoping. It's still unclear who ordered the massacre. Bush phoned Deng before the shooting started, but Deng refused to take his call. The US Congress demanded tougher sanctions. Bush resisted. Within a month, he sent National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger on a secret mission to Beijing to smooth things over. And a year later, China was granted Most Favoured Trading Nation status. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Eastern Bloc was starting to crumble. It was just the kind of revolution the Chinese leaders had feared. And President Bush again trod very carefully, fearing a Tiananmen-style crackdown in Eastern Europe.
We are handling it in a way where we are not trying to give anybody a hard time.
Classified US State Department documents put the death toll from Tiananmen Square at just over 10,000. At least that number was sent to forced labour camps where many died. Defenders of Bush's approach argue that China's prosperity now is the result of political stability, even if it came at the expense of individual human rights. Critics maintain George Bush thought he understood China, but he didn't. He thought the protests would end peacefully. They didn't. His martini-set style of polite, low-key diplomacy just didn't cut it. And in the aftermath, they argue he was more concerned about maintaining US relations with China than the rights of those who were shot and crushed in Tiananmen Square. Well, for more on the Bush administration's reaction to the Tiananmen Square massacre, we're joined by Kim Hoggard, who served in both the Reagan and Bush administrations, and at the time of Tiananmen was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, working alongside the Secretary of State, James Baker. Kim Hoggard, welcome back to Planet America.
Thanks, John.
So we've heard the criticisms that were voiced in 1989 and even after President Bush's death not so long ago, that his measured response to Tiananmen was possibly a little too low-key and that he was more concerned about trade than human rights. To what extent is that a valid criticism, do you think?
Bush's response was really driven from his own personal experience, his personal relationships that he had with many Chinese leaders at the time. He had been the first U.S. liaison representative to China. So I think his main interest was making sure that the long-term interest of the United States, as well as the progressing the development in the relationship with China was the overriding issue.
Do you have a sense of what his emotional response actually was in private?
Yes.
Was he surprised by the brutality and the scale
Yes.
of that?
Yes, he was. And he was appalled. He was appalled by the violence. And he made that very clear publicly and privately. I think because he knew some of the players in the Chinese government for decades, I think he took it quite sensitively and was disappointed with the outcome, maybe a bit naive, but yes, he was absolutely appalled and deplored the violence and consistently sent that message in as many ways as he could. He actually sent a secret mission of his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and the Deputy Secretary of State, and they went on an actual midnight mission, flew to China 24 hours in and out, actually didn't even stop for refueling because they didn't want to alert anyone, so they refueled the plane midair, and brought this message that while the U.S. is condemning this action, we don't condone this action, we are pleading with them to show restraint, but at the same time, we want to keep the door open to communications.
6 months later, when that trip by Scowcroft and Eagleburger was made public, it was leaked in the newspapers, the criticism then was that this was a reassurance mission, not a mission to communicate the condemnation of the Bush administration. You seem to be suggesting that there was a good deal of concern being expressed. It wasn't just about saying, don't worry, this will blow over, we'll get back to business as usual pretty quickly.
Absolutely not. And he was quite clear in that message and publicly that the relationship between the United States and China could not move forward until the repression ended. You know, President Bush really thought that the Army was somewhat sympathetic to the students. And in fact, history shows that the Chinese actually brought in some other troops from the outside of Beijing who were not as sympathetic to the students, who actually were the front line of that massacre.
Was it a reasonable characterisation, or was it more of a calculated sort of political judgment for President Bush to essentially try and say this was an element within the People's Liberation Army, the Army still loves the people still love the Army, and it's certainly not the Deng administration or government's fault? It's almost as though there was just this sort of, extremist element with a bunch of armoured personnel carriers that decided to run over 10,000 people one night.
He said openly that he did not know why it was and who made this order. And I'm not sure we've ever known exactly where that came from. I don't think he ever defended it as sort of rogue elements within the Army. I don't think anybody was naive enough to think that there wasn't an order that came from above.
With the benefit now of 30 years of hindsight, given that Tiananmen really did suppress the pro-democracy movement, and particularly the student-led pro-democracy movement, did the Bush administration miscalculate? Did they assume that, as with the Soviet Union, there would be greater freedoms that would inevitably come with greater economic empowerment of the population, and that really just hasn't happened?
I don't think they necessarily thought that it was going to be something that happened soon, that economic reform and market reform would progress China to democratic rule. Now, of course, the debate will remain as to whether he took a strong enough stance. Personally, I don't think whatever he did would have changed the trajectory of the Chinese government, such as the power of the Communist Party there. And of course, the Soviets took the step of going down a democracy highway and did not have an economic highway in place. Now, you could say that at least the Chinese have done it in an order in which has allowed a middle class to grow, whereas in now Russia basically have oligarchs and corruption and not an economically viable country that is supporting all of its people. Where are we with both countries? Still, neither one are a perfect example of what the West would like to see.
Kim Hoggard, good to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right at the end of 2017, 65% of Americans were given a tax cut, or as former Reagan economic advisor turned lefty Bruce Bartlett put it,
it's really akin to rape.
Nancy Pelosi thought the disaster was a lot bigger than that.
This is Armageddon.
Whereas journalist Kurt Eichenwald knew a tax cut wasn't the end of the world, he tweeted, "America died tonight." Pretty unhinged rhetoric for what was an effective corporate tax cut from 23 to 12% and an effective individual tax cut from 9.6 to 9.2%. Although, admittedly, the tax cuts were applied in a fairly unequal fashion, with those earning between $200,000 and $500,000 a year receiving easily the greatest percentage increase in income. And the tax cuts were approved of in an unequal fashion too. 71% amongst Republicans and 10% amongst Democrats. So who was right? Well, the assessments from year one are starting to come in from neutral groups like the Congressional Research Service. There you go. So let's dig in.
Big, beautiful world.
Now, most people know that the American economy is doing well. Decent growth rate, low unemployment rate. But how much of all this is because of the tax cut? Well, this here is the prime age employment ratio for the last few years. Can you see where the tax cut started? Here's a clue. So, maybe these trends here were a little bit baked in. There is a little bit more visible difference though when it comes to economic growth. The post-tax cut period you see here is definitely stronger than the immediate pre-tax period, although overall it hasn't exactly taken off like a rocket, has it? So let's dig a little bit deeper. Tax cuts were supposed to bring corporate cash back that was hidden overseas.
We expect to have in excess of $4 trillion brought back very shortly.
Wow, $4 trillion. Now, in this case, you can totally see where the tax cut happened. It happened right there. Big jump in repatriated cash. But it wasn't so much $4 trillion as $660 billion, which, don't get me wrong, is still a lot of money. That's money that companies could use to shower their workers with bonuses. We're talking $4.4 billion of bonuses, by the way, according to one count. Sounds like a lot of money, although $28 per worker doesn't sound like quite so much money, and 2 to 3% of the corporate tax cut sounds even less, especially when there are over $8 trillion of stock buybacks over the same period, enriching shareholders and executives. But let's face it, those bonuses there, they were just that, bonuses. The main thing that corporate tax cuts are supposed to do is increase investment. That increases productivity, and that increases output and economic growth, and finally, wages. So, did the tax cuts boost investment? Not so much. Picking the tax cut this time, it happened, like there. Not a great return. In fact, the Congressional Research Service report explicitly says that this result was inconsistent with the incentive effects of the tax change. Although, to be fair, this entire period after the tax cut was while Trump was fooling around with trade wars, and business capital spending is notorious for being sensitive to uncertainty. So the tariffs may be a factor. Also, this is when it gets a little bit messy because productivity has gone up a little bit since the tax cut, especially in the last quarter. In fact, multi-factor productivity, which is the productivity generated by new technology implementation, that rose by the greatest amount for the whole expansion. So did all this boost output? No. In fact, manufacturing output has dropped a lot recently. So mixed results as far as tax theory goes. But did we at least see the end result of wages going up? After all, the White House did predict an increase of $4,000 to $9,000 of extra wages per year just from the corporate tax cuts. No, that did not happen. Real wages increased by 1.2% in 2018, with ordinary workers receiving very little growth in wage rates. Although, admittedly, things are picking up a little bit this year. One thing has changed, though, in a big way since the tax cuts: corporate tax revenue. I bet you can pick where the tax cut happened here. Yeah, you guessed it, right there. Corporate tax receipts have dropped 31%. And the effect that this had on overall revenue, 3.6% less in dollar terms, 5.4% less after inflation, and 8.1% less as a share of GDP. And that all filters through to the deficit, of course, which, as you can see, it was dropping, and now it's gotten bigger again. And by the way, if we map that up against the unemployment rate, where, don't get confused, we've flipped the unemployment rate axis so it goes from low to high here, you can see that this is the first time in 65 years the deficit has become bigger while the unemployment rate in a big way has fallen. In fact, the fastest growing line item in the budget at the moment is net interest payments on the debt, up 19% in 2018. Okay, enough of all that. So, in summary, investment, wages and productivity. There are some very positive signs there after the tax cut, but none of them show a big break in the trend that was already happening anyway. This might still change, of course, still early days, but we might just want to be cautious before we consider implementing any further. Ah, God, already.
Big, beautiful world.
Well, we are just about out of time for another trip to Planet America, but first, Chaz, you've got a bit of Mueller news for us.
Always do. As part of Michael Flynn's case, the judge this week made the Department of Justice release the full transcript of a call described in the Mueller report. This was after Flynn's lawyer told the White House that Flynn could no longer legally have confidential communications with the White House, okay? Nothing confidential. And so, according to the Mueller report, Trump's lawyer, John Dowd, left a phone message saying, if there's information that implicates the president, then we've got a national security issue. So, you know, we need some kind of heads up, just for the sake of protecting all our interests, if we can. Remember what we've always said about the president and his feelings towards Flynn.
That sounds dodgy as hell, Chaz.
It does. He's not supposed to be angling for confidential information, except...
Yes?
Mueller's team left out the bit where Dowd said, without you having to give up any confidential information. Seems kind of relevant to me. Now, admittedly, even in context, that transcript isn't great, but Mueller's team leaving out the most relevant sentence of the transcript in their report seems like a bit of a concern. And it's led to a bizarre situation where Republican Devin Nunes is now demanding Bill Barr release all the supporting sources and documents from the Mueller report, just like the Democrats have been calling for a month. There are some twists in this tale yet.
It's not over. Okay. But that is it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you next week.
Yes, see you later. Don't forget the extra where we talk about a whole lot more on Facebook and iView. See you there. Bye-bye.